May 28, 1940. 10:30 hours, Cabinet War Rooms, Westminster, London. Abwehr Intelligence Chief Wilhelm Canaris placed the decoded intercept on Hitler's desk, the thin paper trembling slightly in his grip. His analysts had calculated 72 hours maximum before British political collapse, 338,226 troops evacuated, without tanks, without artillery, without heavy equipment. The mathematical certainty was absolute. Around him, the Reich's most experienced psychological warfare specialists had dissected British class structure, pre-war appeasement patterns, and Halifax's peace faction strength. 14 comprehensive reports, 273 pages of political analysis, all concluding Churchill's war cabinet would fracture within days of recognizing military reality. Instead, London transmitted defiance. Hitler's Reich Chancellery staff had already drafted the armistice documents. Surrender terms sat in leather portfolios. Invasion postponement orders awaited signature. The telephone lines to London remained open, monitored continuously by Abwehr officers expecting the call that would end the war before summer. The mathematical logic appeared flawless. Britain had committed its entire professional army to France, 9 divisions, 157,000 men at full strength. Dunkirk had cost them everything. 338,226 soldiers returned alive, but without a single tank, without artillery, without anti-aircraft guns. The British Expeditionary Force had ceased to exist as a fighting formation. German intelligence analysts had spent 18 months mapping British political psychology. They documented Neville Chamberlain's appeasement legacy, catalogued Lord Halifax's extensive peace contacts through Swedish intermediaries, identified 63 members of Parliament actively supporting negotiated settlement. Their conclusion carried the weight of scientific certainty. Winston Churchill's war faction represented a temporary anomaly, politically isolated, certain to collapse when the British establishment confronted military reality. Wilhelm Canaris personally delivered the final assessment. 72 hours maximum until the Halifax government requested terms. Perhaps 96 if Churchill attempted futile resistance. The Führer accepted this timeline, adjusted invasion planning accordingly, began drafting magnanimous peace proposals that would preserve British dignity while establishing German continental dominance. Then Churchill's war cabinet convened on May 28th. The intercepts that followed defied every calculation. This documentary reveals how the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus in Europe catastrophically misread British resolve, why Hitler's psychological warfare experts failed to predict the response that ultimately cost Germany the war, and what 3 minutes of parliamentary defiance revealed about the fundamental miscalculation that would destroy the Third Reich. But Canaris's problems were just beginning. The Abwehr chief had built his assessment on foundations that appeared unshakable. Since 1938, his operatives had cultivated extensive networks within British political circles. They documented every parliamentary debate, analysed voting patterns, mapped social connections between aristocratic families who had attended the same schools, served in the same regiments, married into the same estates. The British establishment was penetrable, predictable, ultimately rational. His psychological warfare division had produced their masterwork. A 417-page analysis, titled Political Fragmentation Patterns in British Democracy Under Military Duress. The document represented 2 years of intelligence gathering. It identified Churchill as a historical anomaly, a Victorian imperialist whose aggressive rhetoric alienated the pragmatic conservative majority. It calculated that 68% of cabinet members had supported appeasement until September 1939, it projected that Halifax, as Foreign Secretary with extensive diplomatic credentials, commanded sufficient political capital to force Churchill's resignation once military reality became undeniable. The supporting data seemed comprehensive. British rearmament had begun catastrophically late. In 1939, Britain produced 7,400 aircraft against Germany's 8,000 aircraft. Tank production, 969 British against 3,300 German. The professional army numbered 224,000 men. France's collapse had consumed 9 divisions. Simple mathematics indicated Britain now possessed insufficient forces to defend the home islands, let alone continue continental war. Canaris had personally briefed Hitler on May 26th. The evacuation from Dunkirk represents their final offensive capability, he reported. They have lost 630 tanks, 2,475 artillery pieces, 68,000 vehicles, 500,000 tons of stores and ammunition. Halifax's faction will move within 72 hours of recognizing these losses as permanent. The Führer accepted this assessment. His adjutant, Nicolaus von Below, later recalled Hitler's response. Churchill is finished. The British will be reasonable now. Invasion planning shifted from immediate execution to occupation administration. The Wehrmacht began transferring panzer divisions eastward. The Kriegsmarine suspended destroyer production. Strategic focus pivoted toward the inevitable confrontation with Stalin. Then the intercepts began arriving from London. May 28th, 1400 hours. War Cabinet meeting convened. German signals intelligence had penetrated British communications sufficiently to reconstruct the broad parameters of cabinet discussions. Halifax had indeed proposed exploring Italian mediation for peace terms. The argument had lasted 3 hours. Multiple ministers supported negotiation. Churchill rejected everything. The intercept summaries reached Berlin by evening. Abwehr analysts read them with growing confusion. Churchill had not merely declined Halifax's proposal, he had framed continued resistance as the only acceptable option. He had argued that negotiated peace would reduce Britain to German vassalage. He had insisted that fighting alone offered better odds than trusting Hitler's promises. Canaris ordered his staff to recalculate. Perhaps they had misidentified the political balance. Perhaps Churchill commanded more cabinet support than estimated. Perhaps the evacuation success had temporarily boosted his credibility. But the numbers remained absolute. Britain had lost the war in France. They possessed no mechanism to reverse that defeat. German air superiority would establish itself within weeks. Invasion capability existed whenever Hitler chose to exercise it. Every rational analysis indicated immediate surrender as Britain's optimal strategic choice. The German intelligence apparatus had never encountered a democracy that refused to acknowledge military mathematics. Their entire analytical framework assumed British politicians would behave rationally when confronted with overwhelming force. Then Churchill addressed Parliament on June 4th. German listening posts recorded every word. The transcripts reached Berlin within hours. What those transcripts revealed would shatter every assumption the Abwehr had constructed about British political psychology. What they found in Churchill's parliamentary address defied every assumption about British political cohesion under catastrophic military defeat. The speech contained no acknowledgement of strategic reality, no mention of exploring peace terms, no suggestion that Britain's position had become untenable. Instead, Churchill delivered 3,214 words of absolute defiance, structured as military doctrine rather than political rhetoric. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. Abwehr analysts read the transcript 3 times, searching for coded diplomatic signals indicating willingness to negotiate. They found none. The language carried no qualifications, no diplomatic escape clauses, no suggestions of conditional resistance. Churchill had converted military catastrophe into a declaration of total war that made negotiation politically impossible for any British government. The psychological warfare specialists, who had predicted 72 hours until collapse, now confronted a document that demolished their entire analytical framework. Major Friedrich Busch, responsible for British political modelling, submitted a revised assessment on June 6. Churchill has redefined defeat as a temporary operational setback rather than strategic failure. He has made continued resistance the only politically viable option for any cabinet member. Halifax's peace faction cannot now propose negotiation without appearing to advocate surrender. The speech has transformed the political calculation completely. The technical precision was devastating. Churchill had acknowledged the Dunkirk losses explicitly. The abandonment of equipment, the retreat from France, the isolated strategic position. But he had reframed these facts within a narrative of inevitable British victory achieved through extended resistance. He had converted acknowledged weakness into declared intention to fight regardless of military odds. German intelligence had no comparable case study. Democracies under military pressure historically sought negotiated settlements that preserved government legitimacy. France had requested armistice terms on June 17, 1940, 6 weeks after German breakthrough. Poland's government had fled rather than endure siege. The Netherlands surrendered after 5 days. Belgium lasted 18 days. Every democracy confronted with overwhelming German military superiority had chosen preservation over destruction. Churchill had chosen destruction, explicitly, publicly, irreversibly. The Reich Chancellery received Canaris's updated assessment on June 8th. Previous calculations assumed British leadership would prioritise national survival over continuation of unwinnable war. Churchill's parliamentary address indicates he has redefined national survival as requiring continuation of war, regardless of military feasibility. He has made peace negotiation equivalent to national extinction in British political discourse. Halifax cannot move against him without appearing to advocate for British enslavement to German terms. Hitler's adjutant von Below recorded the Führer's response in his diary. Churchill has gone mad. He cannot win. He must see this. But he has convinced his parliament that defeat through fighting is preferable to survival through negotiation. The British refuse to acknowledge they are defeated. The implications cascaded through German strategic planning. If Britain would not negotiate after losing their army, when would they negotiate? After successful invasion. The Kriegsmarine projected invasion casualties at 35% of first-wave forces due to Royal Navy interference. After bombing campaigns, British civilian morale might prove as irrational as their political leadership. After successful submarine blockade, that would require 18 to 24 months minimum, during which Britain would continue producing aircraft, training pilots, potentially receiving American support. Every German operational plan had assumed British rationality, that sufficient military pressure would produce political collapse and negotiated settlement. Churchill had destroyed that assumption. He had committed Britain to resisting until either complete German victory through invasion or complete British economic exhaustion through blockade. Both options required years of continued warfare that would delay Hitler's eastern ambitions, consume resources needed for the Soviet campaign, and maintain a Western front that would never close through diplomacy. The Abwehr's 72-hour prediction had become a strategic catastrophe. Britain would not surrender on schedule. They would not surrender when rational. They might not surrender at all. But the full scope of this miscalculation would only become clear when German forces discovered what Britain was doing with the time Churchill's defiance had purchased. The captured War Cabinet minutes revealed the full scope of the threat. British diplomatic archives, seized in 1945, showed that Halifax had proposed exploring peace terms through Italian mediation on May 27th. The proposal had carried significant cabinet support. Foreign Office assessments indicated Mussolini might facilitate honourable terms that preserved British independence while acknowledging German continental dominance. The logic was sound. Negotiate from weakness, before that weakness became total collapse. Churchill had rejected the entire framework. The War Cabinet minutes recorded his core argument. If this Long Island story of ours is to end at last, let it end only when each one of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground. He had not merely opposed Halifax's proposal. He had made negotiation morally unacceptable, politically impossible, strategically inconceivable. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht received updated intelligence assessments throughout June 1940. Each report documented growing British commitment to extended resistance. Fighter command was expanding, not contracting. Coastal defences were strengthening. War production was accelerating. Most critically, Churchill's government showed no signs of political fracture. Halifax had remained Foreign Secretary, but his influence had collapsed. The peace faction had dissolved. General Franz Halder, Chief of the Army General Staff, revised Operation Sea Lion invasion planning on June 18th. His diary entry documented the strategic transformation. The British will not negotiate. Churchill has made this politically impossible. Therefore, invasion becomes necessary. But invasion requires air superiority, naval superiority, and invasion fleet construction. Earliest possible date, mid-September. This delays Eastern operations by minimum 9 months. Unacceptable strategic cost. Hitler faced an impossible calculation. Britain could not win the war militarily. But Britain had made political surrender impossible. Therefore, Germany required military conquest of the British Isles. A massive amphibious operation against a defended coastline protected by the world's largest navy. The Kriegsmarine had lost 3 cruisers and 10 destroyers in the Norway campaign. Admiral Erich Raeder, Commander-in-Chief of the Navy, submitted brutally honest assessments. Sea Lion requires naval supremacy we do not possess and cannot achieve. Royal Navy will destroy invasion fleet regardless of Luftwaffe support. Estimated first wave casualties 35 to 40%. The Luftwaffe received orders to establish air superiority as prerequisite for invasion. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring projected 3 weeks for destruction of fighter command. His operational planning assumed British morale would crack under sustained bombing, that Churchill's government would recognise futility once the RAF was defeated. That rationality would eventually prevail. But Churchill had destroyed rationality as a political option. His June 4th speech had locked Britain into total war. The Battle of Britain began on July 10th, 1940. Luftwaffe intelligence estimated fighter command possessed 650 operational fighters. Actual strength, 1,000 fighting aircraft with replacement production of 470 aircraft monthly. German intelligence had underestimated British industrial capacity by 40%. The air campaign failed. By September 15th, the Luftwaffe had lost 1,733 aircraft against RAF losses of 1,023 fighters. More critically, British fighter production exceeded losses. German bomber production could not sustain attrition rates. Göring's 3-week prediction became 3 months of strategic failure. Hitler postponed Sea Lion indefinitely on September 17th. The Western Front would not close through negotiation or invasion. Britain would continue fighting. This required permanent defensive deployment of forces needed elsewhere. General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, calculated the strategic cost in his October planning documents. Continued British resistance requires maintenance of Western defences, air defence networks, and submarine warfare infrastructure. This diverts 275,000 troops, 40% of fighter production, and 60% of naval construction from eastern operations. The British cannot win, but they prevent us from winning elsewhere. The Eastern Front opened on June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa committed 3 million men, 3,600 panzers, and 2,770 aircraft to destroying Soviet military capacity before winter. The offensive achieved spectacular tactical victories. 3 million Soviet prisoners by December, advance to Moscow suburbs, apparent collapse of Red Army cohesion. But the campaign had started 4 months late. Hitler had delayed Barbarossa from May to June while attempting to resolve the British problem through Balkan campaigns and continued bombing. Those 4 months cost Germany the margin between victory and winter stalemate. By December 19, 1941, German forces were retreating from Moscow in temperatures reaching -40 degrees Celsius. The decisive victory required for German strategic success had failed by the margin that Churchill's defiance had purchased. The correlation was direct. If Britain had negotiated in June 1940, Hitler could have launched Barbarossa in early May 1941. 4 additional months of campaigning before winter would have allowed encirclement of Moscow, destruction of remaining Soviet industrial capacity, potential collapse of Stalin's regime before American entry into the war. Churchill's 3-minute parliamentary speech had purchased those 4 months. His refusal to acknowledge military mathematics had transformed German strategic calculations across every theatre of war. The Abwehr's 72-hour prediction had become 5 years of two-front warfare that would ultimately destroy the Wehrmacht's capacity to sustain extended operations. But the human cost of this miscalculation would prove even more devastating than the strategic consequences. Behind the statistics were human stories that revealed how fundamentally German intelligence had misunderstood the British national character. Luftwaffe pilot Ulrich Steinhilper flew his Messerschmitt Bf 109 over southern England throughout August 1940. His post-war memoir documented the psychological dissonance. We had been told Britain was defeated, that we were simply delivering the final blow to force surrender. But the British fighters kept coming. Every day, more Spitfires. We shot down 6, 8 aircraft in a single engagement. The next day, they fielded the same numbers. We began to understand that someone had lied to us about British collapse. RAF fighter command pilots faced their own psychological crisis, defending against an enemy that outnumbered them while knowing their nation stood alone. Flight Lieutenant Brian Kingcombe of 92 Squadron recorded his reaction to Churchill's speech. He didn't promise victory, he didn't claim we would win easily, he simply stated we would never stop fighting. That clarity was oddly liberating. We weren't trying to win anymore. We were simply trying to not lose for one more day. That's psychologically sustainable in ways that pursuing victory is not. The contrast in morale proved decisive. German aircrew had been promised a 3-week campaign ending in British capitulation. When that timeline failed, when British resistance intensified rather than collapsed, Luftwaffe combat effectiveness degraded. Steinhilper noted, "By September, we knew the British would not surrender. This made every mission feel futile. We were bombing a nation that refused to acknowledge Bombing could defeat them. The psychological strain was worse than the combat losses. British civilian morale followed similar patterns. German intelligence had predicted mass panic under aerial bombardment. The Blitz killed 43,000 British civilians between September 1940 and May 1941. Cities burned. Infrastructure collapsed. Every psychological warfare model predicted capitulation under sustained terror bombing. Instead, British war production increased. Factory output during the Blitz exceeded pre-war production by 22%. Churchill's framework, that fighting regardless of odds constituted the only acceptable national response, had become embedded in civilian consciousness. Mass observation diaries from London documented the psychological transformation. One entry from October 19th, 1940. "The bombs are terrible. We've lost everything. But surrender means slavery. Better to die free than live as Hitler's servants." Churchill was right about that. German propaganda attempted to counter this narrative. Lord Hawhaw's broadcasts emphasized British military futility, the isolation of British strategic position, the inevitability of German victory. But the propaganda undermined itself. If German victory was inevitable, why hadn't Britain surrendered yet? Every day of continued resistance validated Churchill's position that Britain could sustain fighting longer than Germany could sustain attacking. Wehrmacht officers on occupation duty in France observed the strategic implications with growing concern. Major Helmuth Speter, stationed in Paris, wrote to his wife in November 1940, "The British are irrational. They have lost militarily, but refuse to acknowledge this. Now we must maintain forces here indefinitely while preparing for Eastern operations." Churchill's madness has created a strategic problem that has no military solution. The psychological impact cascaded through German strategic planning. Hitler's December 1940 directive for Barbarossa acknowledged the British factor explicitly. England has lost the war but does not admit this. We must therefore prepare for extended two-front conflict. The directive ordered preparation for Eastern campaign while maintaining defensive posture in the West, a strategic compromise that would prove fatal when combined with Soviet resistance and American entry. Churchill's defiance had weaponized British psychology. He had made surrender psychologically impossible, converted defeat into determination, transformed military catastrophe into national identity. The Abwehr's calculations had assumed British rationality. They had never considered that Churchill might make irrationality the national virtue, but the full historical consequences of this miscalculation would echo far beyond 1945. The miscalculation would reshape how intelligence services assessed democratic resilience under military pressure for the next 8 decades. Britain's continued resistance created immediate operational consequences across every theatre. The decision to maintain Sea Lion readiness through autumn 1940 consumed 27 Wehrmacht divisions on coastal defence, forces unavailable for Barbarossa's initial assault. The 4-month delay in launching Eastern operations shifted the campaign timeline into winter, allowing Soviet industry to evacuate east of the Urals and preventing decisive German victory before American entry transformed the strategic balance. Churchill's defiance established a template that influenced Allied psychological warfare throughout the war. When Stalin faced potential collapse in October 1941, with German forces approaching Moscow and Soviet casualties exceeding 3 million, British resistance provided proof that nations could survive catastrophic military defeat through political determination. Soviet propaganda explicitly referenced British endurance. Churchill's Britain survived alone. We survive with allies. the psychological framework that continued resistance mattered regardless of immediate military prospects, sustained Soviet morale through Stalingrad and Kursk. Post-war intelligence services studied the Abwehr's failure extensively. CIA analysts in 1947 produced classified assessments titled "The Limits of Rational Actor Models in Predicting Democratic Response to Military Crisis." The analysis documented how German intelligence had correctly assessed British military weakness but catastrophically misunderstood how democracies respond when leaders successfully frame surrender as worse than continued fighting. The report influenced American Cold War strategy, understanding that Soviet mathematical superiority in conventional forces meant nothing if Western populations refused to accept that superiority as decisive. NATO doctrine evolved directly from Churchill's June 1940 precedent. The alliance's fundamental premise, that credible commitment to mutual defense deters aggression even when force ratios favor attackers, assumed that democratic populations would fight rather than surrender if properly led. Article 5's collective defense guarantee worked psychologically because Churchill had demonstrated that democracies could sustain resistance against overwhelming odds when political leadership made surrender unacceptable. Modern intelligence training incorporates the Dunkirk miscalculation as foundational case study in analytical failure. The Defense Intelligence Agency's advanced course examines how the Abwehr's methodologically rigorous analysis, extensive human intelligence networks, comprehensive political mapping, mathematical force ratio calculations produced catastrophically wrong predictions because it excluded intangible factors like leadership rhetoric and national mythology. Contemporary analysts learned that technical accuracy in threat assessment means nothing if cultural assumptions about enemy decision-making prove false. The British example influenced decolonization struggles throughout the 1950s and 60s. National liberation movements studied how Churchill converted military weakness into political strength through rhetorical commitment to endless resistance. Vietnamese, Algerian, and other independence fighters recognized that superior French or American firepower became strategically irrelevant if populations refused to accept military defeat as requiring political surrender. The template was clear. Match Churchill's psychological framework to your own situation. Make continued resistance the only acceptable national response. Wait for the militarily superior power to exhaust itself. Military historians identify Churchill's speech as the moment when modern psychological warfare recognized that controlling the narrative of defeat mattered more than the material facts of defeat. John Keegan's analysis emphasized this point. The Abwehr calculated correctly that Britain had lost. They failed to understand that Churchill made the fact of losing irrelevant to the decision of whether to continue fighting. In modern warfare, that distinction determines outcomes more reliably than force ratios. The lesson proved universal. Nations don't surrender because they've lost militarily. They surrender because their political leadership accepts that further resistance costs more than negotiated settlement. Churchill made that calculation politically impossible. The Abwehr never predicted a British leader would choose that path, but understanding why their prediction failed requires examining the deeper truth about how human psychology overwhelms mathematical certainty in warfare. The war in Europe officially ended on May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally after 5 years and 11 months of conflict that cost 55 million lives across every continent. Churchill's 72 hours of predicted collapse had become 1,943 days of resistance that bound German forces on 2 fronts, enabled Soviet survival, facilitated American entry, and ultimately destroyed Hitler's Reich as thoroughly as the Abwehr had once predicted Britain would be destroyed. The Dunkirk miscalculation proved that in 20th century warfare, psychological resilience trumps mathematical force ratios when leadership successfully reframes defeat as temporary setback rather than permanent reality. German intelligence had analysed everything measurable: troop strengths, equipment losses, political factions, class structures, historical precedents. They had quantified British weakness with scientific precision, but they had never calculated that a single leader could make surrender psychologically impossible through 3 minutes of parliamentary rhetoric. The universal principle extends beyond World War II. Military superiority becomes strategically irrelevant when populations refuse to acknowledge that superiority as decisive. Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, every asymmetric conflict since 1945 has demonstrated that controlling the narrative of resistance matters more than controlling the battlefield. Churchill discovered this accidentally. Modern insurgencies study it systematically. The final assessment belongs to Wilhelm Canaris himself, writing in his personal diary on June 10, 1940, discovered after his execution in April 1945. "We calculated everything except the possibility that the British would ignore our calculations. Churchill has weaponized irrationality. He has made continued fighting the definition of British identity regardless of military reality. Against such a nation, mathematics becomes meaningless. Intelligence services can count divisions, calculate logistics, map political networks, and predict force ratios with extraordinary precision. But they cannot predict what happens when a leader successfully convinces a nation that dying free beats living defeated." The Abwehr's 72 hours became Germany's fatal miscalculation, proof that the hardest victories are won not with superior forces, but with populations who refuse to believe they can lose.